Just a little over a year. Do you fear that Rick James or his associates will come after you? Is that why you're in disguise now? The man across from the camera shifted, voice low, face blurred. Absolutely, yes, very much. He sounded less angry than exhausted, as if the memory itself still burned. He said he had been deeply disappointed in Rick, maybe even furious with him. And like so many people who crossed paths with legends, he had watched another artist step into a spotlight that once felt like it belonged to someone else. They called Rick James the king of punk funk, a wild icon, a super freak. But before his death in 2004, Rick himself was believed to have whispered a confession that stunned anyone who heard it. The world never knew who I really loved and who I was hiding from. For decades, the music business presented Rick as a sex-crazed outlaw, a chaos machine powered by drugs, scandals, and raw ego. But behind the headlines and mugshots, there was a man living a double life. A man who, according to people closest to him, was terrified that one forbidden desire could erase everything he had built. From Secret Companions in 1968 Toronto, to Hidden Nights at Studio 54, to a 3-day disappearance in Minneapolis with a superstar some insiders still refuse to name, Rick carried a secret the industry reportedly worked overtime to smother. And when he finally tried to put the truth on paper, the last 27 pages of his memoir were said to have vanished after his death. Tonight, we open the file Rick James never got to finish the story he feared might cost him his life. Chapter 1. Born into Chaos. Every story about Rick James seems to start the same way, with danger, with fire, with chaos. But the truth is, the chaos didn't begin when the world met him under stage lights. It started long before the fame, long before the scandals, long before the funk. It began inside a cramped duplex on East Ferry Street in Buffalo, New York, where a skinny boy named James Ambrose Johnson Jr. was learning, very early, that the world was not designed to keep him safe. Rick was born in 1948, the third of 8 children. His father, a singer who never made it past barroom stages, walked out when Rick was still too young to fully understand what abandonment meant. What he left behind were a stack of records and a faint echo of talent, raw material Rick would later turn into armor. His mother, Mabel, was suddenly alone with 8 mouths to feed. By day, she picked up whatever work she could find. By night, she moved through the shadows of Buffalo's street economy, running numbers, dealing with bar owners, negotiating with men the neighborhood kids were taught to avoid. Rick studied that world like homework. He learned that survival required charm, silence, and a sixth sense for danger the moment it stepped into a room. Neighbors would later say Rick grew up around pimps, hustlers, and washed-up jazz musicians. He watched men pass out on couches, watched women slap life back into them. He watched deals sour in an instant and noticed that police only appeared when there was something in it for them. In that environment, Rick didn't just grow up, he hardened. He learned to fight, to lie, to run, and when necessary, to perform. He discovered that a song could distract a room long enough for people to forget how hungry they were. He learned that secrets, the right secrets, could keep a person breathing. But he also learned something else, something he kept even quieter. In those overpacked rooms, thick with cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey, Rick began to realize he was different. Not just musically, not just emotionally different, in a way he didn't yet have words for. He found himself drawn to certain boys the same way he was drawn to the rhythm on a Marvin Gaye record. Quietly, fearfully, tenderly. It was a realization he shoved so deep inside himself that for years he almost managed to forget it was there. By 16, Rick had already been arrested. He had already joined a gang. He had already learned how to slip in and out of trouble like smoke escaping a cracked window. When the Vietnam War draft came for him in 1965, he didn't wait for the letter to decide his fate. He ran. Some people say he panicked. Others insist he was simply protecting the last thing he had left, his freedom. But those who believed they knew him best offered another explanation. Rick had spent his entire childhood fighting to survive. He wasn't about to die in someone else's war. He crossed into Canada, and for the first time, the noise of Buffalo faded into something like silence. Toronto in the late 60 seconds was a strange kind of refuge, a city humming with artists, travelers, runaways, and musicians who played not for glory, but because they'd made it through another day. Rick slid into that scene like he had always been meant to be there. He joined a band called the Mina Birds, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from the streets, the police, or the draft board. On paper, he should have felt free. In some ways, he did. But what happened next was something even Rick himself reportedly never expected. It was 1968 when he met him, the Canadian guitarist whose name never appears in any official biography. The man Rick would later describe in private conversations as my first real connection. Those who claimed to be there remember late nights when the others had already left the studio and only those two remained. They would play until sunrise, talking in low voices, laughing in the quiet way people do when they're guarding something fragile. One former bandmate recalled walking in on them, once sitting close, knees nearly touching, speaking in a tone he had never heard from Rick before. Soft, almost shy. Toronto gave Rick James a kind of breathing room he'd never known. It offered him a glimpse of who he might have been if the world had been kinder. And for a short moment, he let himself feel something that frightened him more than the draft notice he had fled. Affection. Real affection. The kind that doesn't need to be performed. The kind that doesn't hide behind swagger or bravado. But secrets like that don't stay safe forever. Whatever label Rick would have dared to put on that relationship if he ever would have remained unspoken, a rumor that lived only in rehearsal rooms and studio hallways. A truth held by a handful of musicians who understood exactly how dangerous it could be if anyone with power found out. Because the music industry of the 1960 seconds operated with rules carved in stone. You could be an addict, you could be a criminal. You could be a womanizer, a walking disaster, a headline waiting to happen, but you could not be a black man who loved men. That, insiders say, was unforgivable. Rick understood this faster than most. He saw what happened to artists who didn't match the image the labels wanted to sell. He listened to executives talk casually about cleaning up a star's public persona. He watched entire careers shrink not because of a lack of talent, but because of identity, and he understood that if his secret ever slipped into the open, there would be no second chance. Not for him, not for anyone like him. So he buried it. Deep. Deep enough that he hoped it might suffocate. To keep it hidden, he began to transform. He built the persona swaggering, loud, unapologetically sexual Rick James. He flirted with every woman in sight, boasted about conquests, drowned himself in bravado. It was a mask made of glitter and fire, a disguise so convincing that even he started to lean into believing it. But masks, no matter how carefully constructed, always crack. And his would fracture in ways nobody around him could have predicted. By 1974, Rick was back in the United States, hungry for fame, hungry for success, hungry for a life where he didn't have to keep running. But he didn't come back alone. He brought something with him from Toronto. Not just sharpened talent, not just ambition. He carried a truth he would spend the rest of his life trying to silence. That the first person he ever truly loved was a man. And in an industry that punished that kind of truth more brutally than any addiction, that single secret would cast a long shadow over everything Rick James became. By the time 1977 rolled around, Rick James had clawed his way out of nearly every trap life had thrown at him. Jail time, street hustling, nights without a bed, threats of deportation. He had walked through all of it and was still standing. But nothing he had survived up to that point prepared him for what came next. Fame. Real fame. The kind that fills a room before you even open the door. On the 18th of March 1977, Rick stepped into Motown Studios on Grand River Avenue in Detroit for his first official meeting. People who said they were there remember him striding in wearing a heavy fur coat, boots pulled up to his knees, and a grin that dared anyone to underestimate him. Berry Gordy, the man whose instincts had built an empire, was not just impressed according to later accounts, he was intrigued. Motown needed something explosive. Rick looked like gasoline with a match in his hand. But behind the oversized sunglasses, the booming laugh, the loud bravado, something else was shifting. Something Rick thought he had buried back in Toronto. something he never expected to follow him into the center of the machine. It started quietly in April 1977 during the recording of You and I. The sessions ran late, the studio thick with heat from the old tube amps. Sometime around 2 a.m., an engineer stepped out of the control room for a smoke break. When he came back, he caught a moment he later said he never forgot. Rick was standing close, too close to the band's keyboardist, a tall, reserved musician from Detroit with a calm voice and gentle eyes. The two men were speaking softly, heads tilted toward each other in a way that suggested they were sharing more than just chords and notes. The engineer didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Within days, according to studio whispers, the story had made its way down the halls. By the summer of 1977, Motown had heard it. In June, Rick was reportedly called into a side office, dim lights, blinds half closed, the air stale with cigarette smoke, where a senior Motown executive laid it out without decoration. "Keep your personal life out of this building. You're a star now. Act like one." Rick walked out smiling, the same cocky swagger in his step. But witnesses later claimed that the moment he hit the empty hallway, his jaw tightened so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. He knew exactly what the warning meant. He had heard this kind of message before, Toronto all over again. Then came Studio 54. By late 1978, Rick's career had erupted. Mary Jane climbed the charts, and suddenly he wasn't just another artist, he was the face of groove, funk, rebellion. When he arrived at Studio 54 on the 10th of December 1978, the doorman didn't bother with the list. He simply pulled the rope aside the way you would for royalty. Inside, under the gold-tinted haze, with disco pounding through the walls and cocaine dust hanging in the air like glitter, Rick let his guard down. Here, at least on the surface, nobody cared who you loved. Not publicly, not officially. It was there, in a shadowed corner of the VIP balcony, that Rick met Luis, a two-year-old dancer from Puerto Rico, with silk-smooth hair and a smile that, as one friend later put it, hit you like electricity. For weeks, the two were nearly inseparable. They danced until sunrise, slipped out of the club with arms locked, rode in taxis without bothering to roll up the windows. They acted, for a brief moment, like the world wasn't watching. And then came the moment that proved it was. On the 28th of December, 1978, at 3:12 a.m., a photographer snapped them, stepping out of Rick's limousine laughing, bodies pressed close, the kind of photo that doesn't need a caption. The next morning, that image was reportedly scheduled to run in After Dark magazine. It never appeared. According to later allegations, Motown bought the entire strip of negatives and paid the photographer to disappear for 3 months. Rick pretended like it was nothing, but people near him said they noticed a change almost immediately. He paced during rehearsals. He scanned rooms before walking in. He checked mirrors twice, sometimes 3 times. Fame wasn't setting him free. It was tightening around his throat. Still, Rick wanted something real. Some form of connection that wasn't a performance. That hunger followed him into August 1980 and onto the stage of the Chicago Theater. Backstage that night was chaos makeup dust floating in the air, instrument cases slamming shut, dancers yelling over managers. But Rick's focus narrowed to one person, Marcus, a rising funk vocalist with a voice built for the spotlight and a smile bright enough to match it. Their chemistry on stage sparked instantly. Off stage, it grew into something quieter, more dangerous. On the 14th of August 1980, after the encore, a sound technician opened the wrong dressing room door. Inside, he said he saw Rick and Marcus kissing. Not sloppy, not reckless, soft, deliberate. Like the rest of the world had dropped away. The technician froze. Rick didn't. He stepped forward, eyes blazing, and whispered, "This stays here. You never saw this." Within minutes, according to people familiar with Motown's methods, security locked down the hallway, confiscated film, escorted the technician to a private office, and had him sign a non-disclosure note. No letterhead, only pressure. That night, Rick skipped the after-party. Instead, he stayed in his hotel room, staring out at the city lights, chain-smoking in silence. The danger was no longer theoretical. Someone had seen him. Someone had proof. and as his star rose higher, the risk grew with it. When Super Freak hit the airwaves in July 1981, Rick became unstoppable, a storm in leather and lace, a walking spectacle of attitude and appetite. To the world, he was a hypersexual, uncontrollable force who boasted about hundreds of women. The mask was flawless, too flawless. But behind the performance, friends later claimed he was coming apart. One of his closest confidants recalled a night in early 1982 inches, a rented house in Laurel Canyon. Rick had just finished a show, buzzing too hard to sleep. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, staring into a glass of whiskey like it held a confession. Then he said something that friend never forgot. "I sleep with women to hide, man. I sleep with men to feel. That's the part I can't let them know." His voice reportedly cracked on the word feel. The room went quiet. The friend said nothing. There were no safe answers. Rick wiped his face, then added, "Motown will bury me alive if this comes out." He wasn't exaggerating. Motown had already buried smaller secrets. They could bury him, too. By the time 1982 drew to a close, Rick understood something devastating. The brighter the spotlight on him, the deeper his truth had to be buried. He wasn't just becoming a superstar, he was becoming a prisoner of his own image. The stage lights were blinding, the crowds deafening, the fame intoxicating. But none of it could silence the truth Rick kept trying to bury, a truth that refused to stay dead, a truth that, according to those who watched his life unravel, would soon be turned against him in ways he never imagined. By the start of 1983, Rick James was standing at the very peak of his fame. Yet, it was said, he had never felt more exposed. His entire existence had become a tightrope. One life for the cameras, another for the shadows balanced over a drop he knew could destroy him. Years of hiding were beginning to tremble under the combined weight of desire, memory, and the terrifying possibility that somewhere, someone held proof of the man he really was. Everything changed one late night in January 1983 at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Rick had just come back from a long recording session at the record plant, nerves still humming from hours of pushing himself in the studio. The hallway outside his suite was unusually still, no laughter, no footsteps, just dim golden sconces casting long, unsettling shadows along the carpet. As he approached his door, he noticed them. Two men, waiting, strangers, clean suits, blank faces, the kind of rigid calm that usually comes with power. One of them held a slim white envelope. The other stepped forward and, without a single greeting, lifted a photograph. The image, according to people who later heard Rick describe it, showed him in a Minneapolis studio caught in a private moment with a young male singer. They were sitting close, bodies angled toward one another, foreheads almost touching, in an intimacy that could not be written off as casual. Rick's smile disappeared. The taller man spoke in a flat, controlled voice. 25,000. No press. Rick didn't argue. He didn't ask where the photo had come from. He didn't demand proof of what else they might have. He paid quickly, with shaking hands. Not because he believed he was guilty of anything immoral, but because he knew how fast an image like that could be weaponized. He knew what Motown could do to him if that picture ever hit the tabloids. That night, according to one close friend, Rick locked himself in the bathroom and stared into the mirror for a long time, wondering how many more images, how many more secrets were waiting in the dark to surface. The fear didn't leave. It followed him. It trailed him all the way into the summer of 1984, when he flew into Minneapolis without advance notice. Purple rain had reshaped the city, turning it into Prince's kingdom. Rick, both threatened by and fascinated with that power, slipped into town under an alias, as if he were on the run from something that had no face. On July 13, he checked into the Leamington Hotel using the name Richard Shaw. Staff members later recalled how tense he seemed, how he kept looking over his shoulder, how his pace quickened every time the elevator doors slid shut behind him. Then, without warning, Rick simply disappeared. He didn't check out. He didn't leave a message. For 3 days, there was no trace of him, no sightings, no calls, nothing. At 5:17 a.m., 3 days later, he walked back into the lobby. His shirt was wrinkled like he'd slept in it, his eyes glassy, his movements slow and distant. Witnesses said he moved like a man stepping out of a dream he wasn't ready to wake from. For decades, rumors circled those missing days. Some people claimed he spent them in a private rehearsal studio with a musician connected to Prince's circle. Others insisted it was a lover, someone Rick cared about deeply, someone he could only be himself with behind locked doors and soundproofed walls. What most accounts agree on is this. When Rick left Minneapolis, something in him had shifted. He became more guarded, more suspicious, more afraid. That fear only deepened as 1985 unfolded. Cocaine, once a temptation, turned into a shield, a way to dull the thoughts that stalked him from city to city. Friends reportedly noticed new rituals, checking behind curtains before speaking, unplugging phones before having private conversations, refusing to undress unless the lights were completely out. One dancer who had toured with him summed it up in a single sentence. Rick wasn't scared of overdosing. Rick was scared of being outed. It was the kind of fear that can make a man sweat even in the dead of winter. Then came March 1986, the moment when everything snapped. Rick had been seeing a young male dancer in Los Angeles, someone ambitious, magnetic, desperate for a shot at fame. Their relationship was passionate, volatile, and suffocated by secrecy. One night, after a heated argument, the dancer exploded. He threatened to sell their story to a tabloid. According to those who heard about the confrontation, Rick froze. Panic surged through him. A scandal like that wouldn't just damage his reputation, it could incinerate his entire career, his catalog, his legacy. Within 48 hours, Motown reportedly stepped in, sending 2 executives to negotiate behind closed doors. The dancer left the city soon after. His name stopped appearing on audition lists. He never joined another major touring company again. When it was over, when the immediate danger had passed, Rick is said to have collapsed into a chair, shaking, tears running through his hands. He wasn't afraid of legal trouble or financial punishment. He was afraid of exposure. By late 1986, Rick was unraveling. Publicly, he was still playing the wild funk rebel, the leather, the rage, the loud sexuality. Privately, he was falling apart piece by piece. He picked fights in bars, he tore up hotel rooms, he slept with strangers just to feel something other than dread. One producer remembered Rick walking into a studio one afternoon looking hollow, voice ragged from too many nights spent whispering in the dark. He wanted to feel powerful, the producer later said, because inside he felt hunted. The breaking point came in early 1987. Inside a house overlooking the canyon, Rick sat near a window, the Los Angeles skyline glowing beneath him like scattered embers. On the table beside him were lines of cocaine, a half-empty bottle of Courvoisier, and a notebook filled with unfinished lyrics. He wasn't writing. He wasn't talking. He just stared out at the city like it was a jury waiting to deliver a sentence. A close friend strummed a guitar softly nearby, hoping to pull him back from whatever edge he was standing on. After a long silence, Rick gently pushed the guitar aside and whispered something almost too low to hear. "I keep waiting for someone to destroy me." The friend didn't understand. So Rick clarified, his voice cracking under the weight of the words. "Not the drugs, not the cops. The truth, man. If they find out who I've loved, I'm dead." Then he broke. Not with the loud, dramatic explosions the public associated with him, but with the quiet, suffocating grief of a man who has run out of places to hide. By the end of that year, one thing was painfully clear. To the outside world, it looked like drugs were killing Rick James. But according to those who watched him closely, the poison wasn't just in the powder or the bottle. It was in the fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of losing everything. Fear of loving someone he was never allowed to name. Rick James was not simply living a double life. He was drowning in one. By the time the year 2000 arrived, Rick James was no longer the wildfire the world had seen in the 1,980 seconds. Prison time, age, heart problems, and decades of buried secrets had worn him down. His voice had grown rougher, his walk slower, and his eyes, once sharp with rebellion, now carried a heavy, quiet fatigue. But underneath that exhaustion, something new was taking shape. A different kind of urgency, a desire, some people said, to finally stop running from the truth. It began on a cold night in February 2000, high in the Hollywood Hills. Rick had rented a small recording space, a private studio tucked along Laurel Canyon, the kind of place where the air smelled like old carpet, solder, and warmed-up tube amps. The console hummed softly, the room dim, except for a few tired lamps. Only one other person was there with him, a junior sound engineer named Thomas Kelly. As Thomas set up microphones and checked cables, Rick sat alone in the corner with a small handheld recorder, turning it over in his hands as if he wasn't sure whether to trust it. Then, without warning, he pressed the red button. His voice came out low, strained. "I fell in love with a man in Minneapolis," he began, "and I never recovered." Thomas froze mid-step, barely daring to breathe. Rick didn't look at him. He kept talking as if the room had emptied out. He spoke, according to Thomas's later account, about a night in July 1984, how the city lights bounced off the rehearsal studio mirrors, how the music felt secondary to the presence of one person in the room, how he had felt seen for the first time, really seen, by someone who understood the pain hidden under all the swagger and noise. Then Rick said something almost too quiet to catch. "I think that was the real me," he murmured, "and I buried him." Thomas would later insist Rick's hands were shaking the entire time. The recording ended without ceremony. Rick clicked the device off, slipped the cassette into his pocket, and the tape was never seen again. It became one more missing artifact in a life filled with vanishing evidence. Months passed. The mask stayed on, at least in public. In October 2002, another brief fracture appeared. This time it happened in a private interview room in West Hollywood. The sit-down was supposed to be routine promotion for his memoir, a conversation about music, legacy, fame. But once the official cameras were off, Rick reportedly asked the producer for 5 minutes, off the record, 5 minutes of honesty. The producer agreed. Those 5 minutes never aired. They never even made it onto the official logs. Rick leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice lowering to a whisper. "The industry knew my secret," he said, "and they used it." He claimed that every time he tried to push back, to walk away, someone would flash a photograph, mention a name, remind him that he was always being watched. According to the producer, Rick's eyes looked haunted in that moment, like a man who had spent years replaying the same nightmare in his head. By May 2003, Rick had shifted to another method of confession. He began recording personal stories into a kind of private audio journal using tapes he kept locked away. No pages to tear out, no ink to smudge, just his voice, preserved in plastic. One of those sessions reportedly took place on May 12 inside a rented home studio in Burbank. A soft keyboard loop played in the background, just a simple progression, circling like a thought he couldn't shake. Rick paused, then said, "There was a man. The kind of love that doesn't fit in this world. I hurt him. I hid him. I chose my career over the truth, and it's the only thing I regret." Minutes later, you could hear his voice break on the tape, or so those who claimed to have listened to it described. He cried openly, not the explosive, dramatic breakdowns the public might imagine, but a small, shaking sob, the sound of a man crushed under the weight of his own silence. The final and most unsettling confession came the summer of 2004, exactly 1 week before Rick James died. A close friend named Patrick Mitchell visited Rick at his home in Toluca Lake. It was a hot evening, the kind of dry heat that clings to your skin even after the sun goes down. The ceiling fan turned lazily overhead. The house was quiet in that particular way that feels like everything has already been decided. Patrick later said Rick wasn't high, wasn't drunk. If anything, he seemed strangely calm. They sat in the living room, half watching the TV with the sound low, talking about small things, when Rick suddenly cut through the idle chatter. "I'm going to tell the world before they bury me," he said. Patrick asked him what he meant. Rick leaned back, exhaled, and replied, "The part of my life they never let me speak, the men, the love, the truth, all of it." He gestured toward a stack of papers on the coffee table pages from his unfinished memoir. Patrick picked them up, flipping through the mess of handwriting and typed paragraphs. The script was uneven, sentences crossed out, margins filled with memories that looked too raw for a ghostwriter to polish. Then Patrick noticed something strange. Sections that should have been about Minneapolis. Toronto, Studio 54. The men who had mattered. There were gaps, places where entire chunks had been torn out, pages gone, cleanly removed, leaving only the thin scars of ripped paper at the spine. Rick James died on the 6th of August, 2004. Within 48 hours, the remaining manuscript, nearly 200 typed pages, was delivered to his publisher. 27 pages were missing. Not random, not scattered, all of them from the section Rick had been working on in his final month. All of them, according to those who saw earlier drafts, focused on his relationships with men. Those 27 pages have never been found, not by his family, not by the publisher, not by the estate. When Patrick asked about them, he claimed someone close to the process simply told him, "It's better this way." But he never accepted that answer, because he remembered what Rick had said that last week, words spoken softly, like a confession or a warning, or maybe both. "They're going to erase the truth again," Rick told him, "unless someone keeps it alive." And in the years that followed, as fragments of his story began to surface, people finally started to understand something devastating about the man behind the legend. Rick James did not spend his final years afraid of death. What he feared, more than a failing heart or another arrest, was the possibility of leaving this world without ever being truly known. When Rick James died on the 6th of August 2004, the world mourned the wild icon, the funk outlaw, the man whose music seemed to explode off the stage. TV specials replayed the same clips. Headlines repeated the same phrases. The legend was loud. Inside certain offices tied to Motown and its legacy, though, there was no spectacle, only motion. Phones rang, doors shut, files were moved, and, according to people familiar with that world, a quiet process began almost immediately, the reshaping of Rick James's legacy. In the first week after his funeral, family members gathered at his Los Angeles home to sort through what he left behind. The house still carried his presence, incense lingering in the air, stacks of old vinyl leaning against walls, notebooks scattered across desks. Half-finished bottles of liquor sat beside unfinished lyrics. Dozens of tapes lay in drawers like trapped voices, waiting for someone brave enough to press play. But what his sister and nephew reportedly found in the top drawer of his writing desk was something very different from the chaos surrounding it. A manuscript. The book he had been working on during the final months of his life. At first glance, it looked complete, nearly 200 pages, neatly stacked and clipped. But the deeper they read, the more obvious the absence became. Whole pieces of the story were missing. 27 pages were gone. Exactly the same 27 pages Rick had told his friend Patrick he was ready to reveal before he died. The pages said to have detailed the men he loved, the nights in Minneapolis, the secret connection in Toronto, the dancer he almost walked away from everything for. Those pages weren't lost. They hadn't slipped under a couch or fallen behind a shelf. They had been removed. Carefully. Cleanly. Someone had made a choice. No one in the family could explain who took them or when. But the timeline was brutally simple. The missing pages disappeared sometime between Rick's death and the manuscript reaching the publisher's desk. A 48-hour window. 2 days in which someone had access, authority, and a reason. From that moment on, Rick's truth wasn't just ignored. It was erased. A year later, in late 2005, a Detroit tabloid quietly prepared to run a small article about Rick's sexuality, reportedly based on a leaked early draft from the memoir. The story never hit the presses. Editors later admitted, under the shield of anonymity, that they had been contacted by representatives with serious legal influence who strongly advised them to reconsider. They didn't argue. They pulled the piece. The story wasn't killed in the room. It was smothered before the ink could dry. For years, the silence held. Thick, heavy. It felt less like respect and more like a warning. Then, in 2011, a crack appeared. A dancer who had once toured with Rick reached out to an independent filmmaker working on a documentary about 1,980 seconds R&B. The dancer insisted on anonymity and agreed to meet only in a shadowed corner of a downtown Detroit cafe. His hands reportedly shook as he spoke, not from shame, but from the sheer weight of what he had carried in silence. Rick loved men, he said. Everybody in the industry knew. They just made sure the public never would. He described the same pattern others had hinted at quietly for years: warning calls from label offices, hush money, photographers paid to destroy negatives, security guards trained not just to protect Rick, but to separate him from anyone who might expose him. He wasn't allowed to be human, the dancer said softly. He was only allowed to be the wild version of himself, the version they could sell. The filmmaker recorded the conversation, planning to use it as one of the documentary's most revealing segments. Then, an email arrived from a concerned legal liaison, advising him to omit the interview for the integrity of the narrative. The subtext was clear. He complied. The footage stayed unseen. The silence, once again, held. But silence doesn't last forever. In 2015, long after most of the old Motown power brokers had retired, a former senior executive agreed to an off-the-record interview for a book about 1,970 seconds, 80 seconds, funk culture. The meeting was never meant to be documented. No recorder. No official transcript. Just memory. The writer secretly taped it anyway. In that leaked audio, the executive said something that stunned even hardened fans and industry watchers. Rick wasn't the only one, he admitted. But he was the one they had to silence. When the writer asked why, the executive hesitated, then answered with a weary sigh, because he was too big, too loud, too black, and if he came out, the whole system would have cracked. It was the closest the public had ever come to anything resembling an admission not about Rick's private life itself, but about the deliberate effort to bury it. And still, the full picture didn't emerge until years later. In 2023, a box of old Motown-related financial documents reportedly surfaced from a storage unit in Glendale, California. At first, the papers looked routine tour budgets, travel receipts, promotional breakdowns, ordinary corporate history. Then someone opened a thinner folder with a simple label, PR Contingencies. Category read, 1,980, 1,984. Inside were invoices and payment requests issued to tabloid writers, club photographers, and freelance journalists. Several of the payments were marked Story Containment and referenced Rick James by his initials. One document, dated the 11th of June 1982, authorized a $4,800 payment to a New York photographer for purchase and destruction of images. Another memo referenced active rumors of inappropriate male associations. Suppress immediately. The most chilling item was a typed directive from late 1981. It didn't mention Rick by name. It didn't have to. Protect the brand. Protect the catalog. Personal matters must not endanger commercial viability. A clean corporate way of saying erase who he is, save what he sells. As the leaked documents circulated online, fans reacted with shock, anger, disbelief. But those who knew how the industry had always operated were less surprised. Because Rick James's life had always been a collision between two forces: the man he actually was, and the man he was required to pretend to be. According to these accounts, the industry didn't move to silence Rick because his truth was scandalous. They silenced him because it was dangerous to the image, to the contracts, to the machine that profited from his voice while denying his full humanity. The truth of a black man loving another man in an era that offered no forgiveness for it. Rick James died believing the world would never truly know him. And in many ways, that fear was justified. So now, what are we left with? We are left with fragments, missing pages, sealed interviews, financial payouts labeled in cold, distant language. We are left with whispered testimonies, with stories that circle back to the same conclusion. Every time he moved toward honesty, the system moved faster. We are left with a man who lived at full volume on stage, but in a suffocating whisper off stage. A man whose greatest terror was not prison, not overdose, not even death itself. It was love. The wrong kind of love. In the wrong era. In the wrong skin. Rick James was not destroyed solely by drugs, fame, or ego. According to those who watched him closely, he was broken by a world that told him the deepest truth inside him was unacceptable, and that any attempt to speak it would cost him everything. And as we close this chapter, one question rises above all the others like a verdict the industry never wanted to hear. If Rick James, one of the loudest, boldest, most unapologetic artists of his generation, had to hide his heart to survive, then how many others were forced into the same silence? How many stories were rewritten? How many files were buried? How many pages were torn out before anyone got the chance to read them? This was not just a scandal, this was a tragedy. The tragedy of a man whose music shook the world, but whose truth the world was never allowed to fully see. And if you believe this story deserves to be told in full, if you believe truth should outlive the silence, then remember this moment. Because in many ways, this is